All right, welcome to today's YouTube video. And this video really is just going to be the all-encompassing guide to using variations in a powerlifting program. So we're going to be talking about why you as a coach or you as an athlete can use variations in yourself or your clients' programs, and why we maybe don't just want to competition-specific squat, bench, and deadlift year-round, and why we can get utility out of variations and the different reasons why we might use those. We'll also be just covering some of my favorite variations and I guess covering why I like to program specific variations more often than others and just the utility of different exercises specifically. So without further ado, let's get right into it. All right, so first off, we just need to define what is a variation. And I think my definition and the way I use the term variation when talking about powerlifting is going to be similar to a lot of modern day coaches and kind of just the modern day meta of programming, just the style of programming a lot of us have kind of gravitated towards. And my definition of a variation is going to be an exercise that is similar in movement pattern as well as execution to the competition specific movement that's oftentimes going to be done with a barbell and can be easily transferable or interchangeable with the comp movement from a volume standpoint. So to kind of give you an idea of what all that means is when I'm thinking of variation, I'm typically thinking, like I said, barbell exercise, similar in execution, that's interchangeable. So something like a pause squat would be an example of a variation to a squat. And why that is one, it's done with a barbell. It's very similar, and by similar, a pause squat is essentially just a squat where you just pause in the bottom. And then it's also going to be interchangeable from a volume standpoint, where I can just plug and play with a pause squat, just take it out of someone's program and put it back in, and not have to change things like set count. We'll kind of get into reps and stuff where you might need to manipulate rep ranges that people are working through and intensity zones people are working through. But oftentimes it's fairly interchangeable. So that would be my example of a variation. Some other examples would be like a tempo bench press, a close grip bench press, a Larson bench press, a pause deadlift, a beltless deadlift. These are all barbell exercises. There's one caveat, we'll get into that. These are all barbell exercises that are executed very similarly, if not the exact same from a cueing standpoint to the competition movement. From a loading standpoint, you can load them similarly to the competition movement with predictability, and we'll cover that. But it's also going to be interchangeable from a volume standpoint in terms of set count. Some examples of things that maybe are sometimes, the term variation is used, but it's, in my opinion, I would consider it an accessory, would be something like a hack squat or a dumbbell press or an RDL in some cases, and we'll kind of cover that as well. These are going to be exercises that are just executed quite a bit different from a stress standpoint. They're just quite a bit different, and you're typically not going to be using a barbell. We'll get into the RDL, but you're typically not going to be using a barbell. So from a loading standpoint, you're just not able to load it quite the same as the comp movement, and it's not going to be executed the same. So we'll just use a hack squat, for example. That's, it's a similar movement in terms of it's a squatting pattern. You're going to be going through knee flexion and hip flexion, but it's going to stress the main movers similarly. It's going to stress the quads in a similar manner as the squat, but it's not the same exercise. You're in a fixed rack of a hack squat where you're sliding up and down the rails. You're in a fixed movement. There's no barbell involved, and the loading just going to be vastly different. The force curve is going to be vastly different. Same goes for a dumbbell bench where you're using dumbbells. It's not similar from a loading standpoint as a comp bench. So I consider those movements accessories. Variations I consider the more competition specific exercises. All right, so one of, if not the most common reason I myself might program a variation for an athlete in their training is the fact that variations are going to be a self-limiting, load-limiting exercise. You're not going to be able to use as much weight on the bar as you do with a variation. And in turn, that means typically, especially in the mid to lower rep ranges, if you're working in those ranges, you're probably going to generate less fatigue. And this can be really helpful for using on something like a secondary session or a tertiary session. If you want more information on primary, secondary day, tertiary days, I have another YouTube video on this channel that covers details microcycle design. So I'd recommend checking that video out as well if you want more info on that. But just to give you a quick rundown, oftentimes what we're trying to do is we're trying to have a primary session one day in the week that's the main day. We're looking to have that be the strongest session, perform the best, and we're using secondary and tertiary days and so on as a means to set that primary day up to be the strongest. So again, if you want more information, check out my video on this channel that details microcycle design. So again, kind of to get back to the load limiting aspect, variations are going to be less fatiguing because they are self-limiting and load limiting. So let's use a pause squat for example. If I give someone a comp squat set of 4 to like an RP 8, meaning they're going to be about 2 reps shy of failure, that's going to generate a different level of fatigue than a pause squat set of 4 at RP 8. Typically, just because the fact is, with a pause squat, or in most variations, if not all variations, you're not going to be able to use as much weight on the bar. And all the variations we're going to discuss in this video, you're just not going to be able to use as much load on the bar, and it's going to in turn generate a different level of fatigue, typically less fatigue, right? So if I give someone a day that's, maybe one day in the week's all comp squat and one day in the week's all pause squat, that pause squat day is going to be less fatiguing because there's less weight on the bar. So in general, less load equals less fatiguing. Some other reasons why we might want to use, a pause squat or a variation rather for a load limiting purpose. Number one would be fatigue, but number two, it's easier to work on technical stuff. And we're going to talk about that later because that's another big example. But a lot of times, less load on the bar is easier to manage your positioning. And you can still train to relatively high intensities, meaning like, you can train relatively close to failure comparison to like a comp movement, but it's less load on the bar. It's easier to manage your positioning. And again, we'll get into positioning stuff, but that's another big reason why we just might simply want less load on the bar. But the number one reason I would say from a load limiting standpoint is it's going to generate less fatigue and be easier on the lifter in their recovery. All right, the next reason why I might use a variation in someone's training is the idea that a variation is a movement constraint, and it's going to kind of force someone into a very specific movement pattern. And we can use that movement pattern to our advantage to teach something from a technique related standpoint, right? So it can just be a great tool for teaching technique. A classic example of this might be if someone's really struggling with their leg drive, and we'll get into all the different variations I like to use and all the different benefits of and from a technique standpoint of all the variations I find myself programming. But like an example might be a tempo bench press. If someone's really struggling with their leg drive and maybe their butt's coming up off the bench, which would thus generate red lights in a meet. Maybe their touches are really poor and the pause on their chest is really poor due to the fact that their leg drive is not staying constant when they're pausing. And we want it to stay constant if that's the technique style we're going for. A tempo bench is a great option because it's going to slow everything down. It's going to force the athlete to stay on their legs longer, and therefore, it's a good opportunity for the athlete to really work on it. Another example, if someone's really just struggling to stay centered over their midfoot during the squat, or just having issues staying over the midfoot and having a nice vertical bar path, maybe they're falling forward often or getting back on their toes often, a pause squat's a great way to really work on this because it's going to force the athlete to pause in the bottom. Therefore, they're more likely to be forced to sit on their midfoot in the bottom. And even if they are having issues forward and back during that pause squat, it's a great opportunity to practice it because it's slowing things down and even pausing things and stopping movement in the bottom to really work on that. So we could just use variations in training as a means to teach technique, and oftentimes that's going to be like a short-term reason why we might use variations in training. All right, so the next reason why we might use variations in training, and kind of as an addition to the technical aspect in the short term as using it as a movement constraint, that movement constraint can be used in the long term as well for skill retention, over the course of an entire year. So what do I mean by this? Or an example of this might be something like if someone's really rushing their deadlift wedge and they really rush the wedge and they yank the bar off the floor and they're not getting, that proper slack pull and wedge. Using something like a beltless deadlift or a pause deadlift can be really good opportunities to slow things down and for the athlete to be more aware of their positioning kind of, immediately off the floor. And that might be something we leave in long term. That could be something we just put on the secondary day all the time. Or maybe we just have a pause top set on the primary day all year round to really work on that skill retention and keep that skill set sharp. Another one might be something like that's common is like a tempo bench press. Putting it, a day or two before the primary bench day is a great way to really continue to work on those technical things like good leg drive, like setting up properly with, good neck pressure, like really working on a proper descent and pause. Putting the tempo bench a few days before is a great way to really prime that primary day, and that might be something we leave in year round. Pause squat's another one that might be something we leave in year round, and we can really use these variations as a means to keep technique and skill sharp in the long term, not just in a short term teaching moment. It might be something that we just need those variations in all the time to keep technique sharp and that skill retention high. So managing localized pain and stress is another reason why we might program in a variation. So a common one is something like if someone's dealing with back pain during a low bar squat, simply giving them a high bar and putting that bar a few inches higher up their back can be a great way to shift some of that stress from the low back and deal with some of that stress or pain, get it away from the low back and shift it to the legs because someone's going to be a little bit more upright. Another reason, just high bar for an example that I'm commonly using to manage localized stress or pain is people whose low bar rack position really just bothers their upper body. It's just, can be a fairly stressful position for a lot of people's upper body. And using something like a high bar gets that bar like 2 inches up higher on the back. It's an easier, less extreme position to get into. It's going to be easier on the shoulders, wrists, and elbows. An SSB squat is another example of a good variation to use in that kind of scenario. So a lot of times just using variations can be a great way to kind of manage pain and manage stress being allocated to a certain area on the body, and we can shift that stress somewhere else to manage pain and manage stress. Another reason, and similar to managing pain or localized stress, is the idea that we can shift stress to a certain muscle group for our benefit of, maybe building muscle or just stimulating that muscle group better. A common one that I like to use a lot is an RDL or Romanian deadlift instead of a regular competition deadlift. And that is because an RDL is more of a pure hinge than a competition deadlift, conventional or sumo deadlift. It's going to be more of a hinge on both, or more of a pure hinge rather. It's also just going to target the hamstrings and glutes more directly and just more purely. So it can be a great option from like a muscle building standpoint, as well as if you just need more stress on the hamstrings and glutes, it's a great way to just get that stress in. Now you could also move to accessory movements and things of that nature to kind of get that stress in, but variations can be a great way as well. Another example would be something like a close grip bench press. Because your hands are a little closer together, you're moving through a longer range of motion. Oftentimes it's going to maybe bias into the triceps a bit more as well. It can be a great muscle building exercise, or even combining two variations, something like a close grip feet up bench is a great option as well. High bar is another great option where bars up your back a little bit, you're going to be a little bit more upright, but you're going to maybe get a little more forward knee travel for some people, and that can be a great way to get more localized stress onto the quads, stimulate the quads better. And whether it's from a hypertrophy standpoint where we're trying to get more hypertrophy in an area, or we just want to target that specific muscle group better to get maybe a primary session or whatever the case may be to perform better down the road, that can be a great way, is just targeting specific muscle groups better. All right, and the last reason why we might use a variation, I'd say is less talked about but still very, very important, is the idea that variations can offer psychological benefits to someone's training. So in general, powerlifting is a very tedious sport. It's very repetitive. Oftentimes we're doing the same microcycles over and over and over, and similar block structures over and over and over, and thus similar exercises. And we have to squat, bench, and deadlift to get better at those exercises. And using variations can be very beneficial to just give something different. So if an athlete's feeling burnt out, oftentimes a variation is a great example of an exercise that, or a strategy we can just employ to bring excitement back to training and give someone something new to train for. Sometimes people will become neurotic or concerned about their numbers, and maybe they're hitting the same numbers over and over and over again on like a secondary day, for example. Using a variation is a great way to just give them new numbers to chase, new PRs to go after. Everything's new, everything's fresh, everything's exciting because it's numbers they've never hit before because they've never trained this variation. I'll give you an example. I have a client of mine where we did the same secondary squat day for a long time, just a comp top set of squats. And we put a tempo squat in on that secondary day with the intention of it just being a short-term technical resolution just to work on something. And after the first block, we had a really good block. And then after that block, we kind of talked, and he's like, yeah, I just felt like from a mental standpoint, I was very excited to come train. It was, very encouraging to be hitting new numbers I've never hit because I've never done this exercise before. And he didn't have as much historical data on this. So if he had a day that maybe wasn't perfect, there wasn't as much frustration, there was nothing to compare himself to in the past. So using a variation is a great, psychological benefit to training as well. All right, so now that we've kind of discussed the reasons why we might reach for a variation when writing an athlete's programming, or why we might, use those, and some of the pros and cons of that, I want to go through every single lift, squat, bench, and deadlift, and kind of cover my most used variations for each lift, and kind of explain why we might use those, and then maybe the opposite is why we wouldn't want to use those in certain situations. So starting off with the pause squat, I think the biggest thing is it's going to promote more control. It's a less extreme version of the tempo squat, and we'll cover tempo squat because that's one of the ones I do like to use as well. But the pause squat It's going to slow the descent down a little bit. And the biggest thing is you're just pausing in the bottom, right? Simple as that. It's a regular comp squat, you're pausing in the bottom. Why we might want to do this: center of mass management. So if an athlete's really struggling with their center of mass management and they're struggling staying over their midfoot and staying, with good, proper foot rooting, the pause squat's a great opportunity to practice this, right? Because when you're descending, you're going to come down, you're going to stop in the bottom. You have to be balanced for that, and if not, you're going to be punished if you're not balanced properly for that. So I love the pause squat for that. I think some of the other benefits is working on depth. So just in general, oftentimes the pause squat is going to be very beneficial for depth purposes because you're pausing in the bottom and the athlete can really feel when they're hitting that bottom position and feeling when they're hitting depth. Now, something I've noticed, and this is never talked about, actually never really seen anyone talk about this that I've seen, but I notice it a lot with my own athletes, and I can think of 2 examples off the top of my head in the past year, is pause squats actually leading to worse depth. And my theory for this is a slower descent speed, because pause squats are naturally going to just force, naturally lifters are going to descend slower. The slower descent speed is going to lead to, less ability to really get down to depth and utilize that stretch reflex because you're pausing. And a lot of athletes, I also think, just get a little bit too forward and they sit in their knees a little bit when doing a pause squat. It's not necessarily their normal squat pattern where maybe they would be allowing themselves to fold over, allowing their hips to travel back because they're pausing. So they'll kind of sit in their knees and they'll run out of range of motion early, as opposed to if they were kind of running through their normal comp descent speed. So I think that is a con of the pause squats, and you do have to be careful. Some athletes it's going to benefit depth, and some athletes it's going to make it worse. And I think if it's something where you are cueing it properly and you're trying to get better depth with it, with someone who really does struggle, I think it'd be beneficial. But if you have someone who's not really struggling with depth and you give them a pause squat, it can throw their movement pattern a little bit out of whack. And I think you really need to be diligent with those people and explain, hey, we really need to make sure we're allowing ourselves to lean forward. We really need to make sure we're allowing those hips to kind of move back in space. And then I think the other big one is the pause squat is going to naturally force a slower descent speed, but it's not to the extreme. I think it's a less extreme version of a tempo squat where, if someone is dive bombing their squats and if they are moving very quickly, I wouldn't reach to the tempo squat first. I think that's a little bit, like I said, extreme. I think it's just too different. I think the pause squat's great because I think people are typically with a pause squat are going to descend at the naturally perfect descent speed for them. So if you give someone a pause squat, they're probably going to slow down just enough to be in their perfect natural descent speed. So I think it's a great option to go to first, as well as it's more specific than the tempo squat. So you can give it to someone, run pause squats for a block or two, and as soon as you pull it out, you can run all pause squats. As soon as you pull the pause out, it's not a big deal. The athlete's going to be able to pick right back up on those comp squats. All right, and then another thing with the pause squat is it is going to, for some people, going to be easier on the knees. So if you have someone who, typically like a narrower stance squatter, more forward knee travel squatter, and they're descending full speed, they may run into some knee issues, and if they are, it could be because they are kind of coming down on the knees hard and they are moving full speed into the hole and then quickly reversing it. You take away that reversal of the pause and you take away all that excess force kind of coming down onto the knees, slamming onto the knees in the bottom, and you throw the pause in there, it may be easier on the knees. So that's a little more anecdotal, a little less common, but typically I think it's a good option for someone if someone is dealing with some knee pain. It's a good way to return back to squatting or even put it in for a little bit and kind of take some stress off the knees. I know I've done that before with clients. So those are the big benefits I see with the pause squat, on top of the fact that it is just simply load limiting. I generally find from a loading standpoint, 92, maybe 93% is kind of where you're going to put that pause squat from in comparison to a comp top set, right? So from a top set, percentage standpoint, 92, maybe 93% tends to be where that kind of seems to fall. All right, so next up's the tempo squat. And I think a lot of the same benefits of the pause squat apply to the tempo squat. The added control is a big one, and you're going to see even more control, right? Because we are actually slowing that descent speed down. Oftentimes we're applying a pause with it as well and kind of combining the two variations. It's going to be easier on the knees. That's another one, again, a little bit anecdotal, but I think that's another benefit you see. Center of mass control is a big one, and you're going to see that even more so with the tempo squat because the lifter has more time to be aware of what their foot is doing when they're actually slowing that descent down. I think one of the big ones, though, that's not talked about that you don't see as much with the pause squat is because you're slowing that descent speed down, the lifter has more time to be aware of what their midsection and their upper body is doing. So the lifter has more time to be aware of bracing mechanics, So if you're running into issues with someone where they're overly flaring their ribs as they're squatting, or they are overly crunching and kind of getting scrunchy and folding over their belt as they're squatting, giving the tempo squat's a great way to just really work on that stuff. Another one is like any upper back tightness stuff. If someone's really just not getting a good shelf, not maintaining that kind of extension through the upper back, giving the tempo squat, great way to practice it. Everything's slowed down. If things with a lifter's comp squat begin to unravel on the way down, giving a tempo squat's a really good way to work on that and fix things, because they have way more time to actually be forced to maintain positioning. So the tempo squat I like to think of as a more extreme version of the pause squat for that reason. Now with the tempo squat, because you're slowing things down so much, I generally don't like to go anything over 5 reps, and really 4 reps or less is kind of the bread and butter. And because there's so much more time under tension. From a loading standpoint, about 90%. When you start getting over 4 or 5 reps, that's when things start to really, it's going to be tough to really program that from a percentage-based standpoint. I generally, though, really like to stay in that 4 to 2 rep range with those, or even singles. Tempo singles are great as well. I typically don't like to go over 4, definitely not over 5 on a tempo squat. As opposed to like a pause squat, you can get away with 5s, you can get away with 6s. You could probably get away with 7s, even 8s. I mean, that would be more rare. But pause squat's going to be more in that anywhere from that 1 to 6, 1 to 7 maybe rep range. With the tempo squat, you're really going to want to say 1 to 4, maybe 1 to 5. And the higher reps you go, the more that loading is going to need to drop off, because there's so much added time under tension. All right, so next up is the high bar squat. And real quick, just to kind of cover what a high bar squat is, I'll throw a video up on the screen. In our normal low bar squat, the bar is going to be on your rear delts or even below. But in a high bar squat, that bar is now higher up. It's going to be on your traps, thus, high bar squat. This is going to cause people to be a little bit more upright, thus biasing the movement into the quads a little bit more, as well as less low back stress. So, we're going to bias into the quads and away from the low back as much. The other thing is it's higher up on the back, meaning it's an easier bar position to be in long term, right? So that low bar position can really be fatiguing. It can beat up the wrists, it can beat up the shoulders, it can beat up the elbows, it can really cause some bicep tendonitis, shoulder tendonitis issues. When you put that bar higher up on the back, it's a lot easier position to be in, especially for more volume type work, think back down work, and higher rep work, or whatever the case may be. It's a lot easier of a position to be in. That's one of the biggest reasons I'm prescribing high bar, is back down work on like a secondary day, making it high bar, saving the elbows, saving the wrists, saving the shoulders, and having that upper body just recover well, as well as biases away from the low back. So I'm a huge fan of high bar for that reason. From a loading standpoint, I generally find like 95 to 90%, 92 to 90%. 92 I think is the sweet spot, but I think about 92 to 90% tends to be kind of the sweet spot there with the high bar squat in comparison to the low bar counterparts, the competition counterpart. All right, so next up on the list is going to be SSB or the safety squat bar. And this is going to be the one variation on this list for all the lifts that's going to violate the barbell only rule. It is still a bar. It's just not a power bar. It's just a specialty bar. I'm going to throw some videos up on the screen so you can see what this looks like. But the big benefits of the SSB is, one, similar to high bar in the sense it's going to be easier on the upper body, and even taking that to the extreme where the hands are actually in front of the barbell, or in front of your body rather than even behind it. Even with a high bar where it's a lot easier position, SSB is going to be even easier with your hands in front of you. It's going to be typically biased into the quads a little bit more, and it's also going to bias away from that low back a little bit more. I think one of the big benefits of SSB is it's so different from a regular low bar squat. It's just different. I think we can really just plug and play with it when we're trying to just get out of overuse stuff. If someone's dealing with some just general overuse pain, some nagging aches and pains, SSB is a great option to get someone into something a little different. Similar, to the high bar where it's easier on the back as well. That's another big one. A lot of times someone's dealing with some chronic back issues, back pain, back tweak. Throwing the SSB on like a secondary day or even both days for a while is a really, really good option. I think one of the biggest benefits of SSB that's often overlooked, but I found it as a huge, huge teaching tool, is for bracing. And because the weight is in front of you, similar to like a front squat, it's going to naturally draw the ribs down. Okay, it's going to naturally draw you more neutral. So if someone's really struggling with overly flared rib cage when they're squatting, this SSB is going to naturally just put them in the right position. A lot of times what I tell people is, you can unrack the SSB, walk it out, inhale, and go. There's nothing else that needs to be done. because the SSB is going to set up for you. Now, if someone's dealing with issues where they're overly scrunched over, or overly folded over their belt, maybe we want to avoid SSB in this case because that could, make things worse and take it to the extreme. But SSB is great for that. From a loading standpoint, I find like 90% in there, similar to high bar, a little less maybe than the high bar squat. With the SSB, the one thing is you're going to not want to load it overly heavy. So you're not going to want to, work in some higher intensity singles, doubles, triples. You're going to want to stay in that like 4 to 8 rep range. And like I said, comparison to a high bar, or to a low bar rather, you're going to want to just knock off about 90-ish% is going to kind of be the sweet spot for that SSB. So if you're doing a top set of 5 at RP8 on like a low bar squat, pull off 90% of that, and that's going to be about a top set of 5 at RP8 on an SSB, for example. That's going to be equated across all rep ranges. But yeah, I think the SSB, the biggest benefit that I've found is the ability to avoid some of the overuse stuff, and then the bracing benefits. I think it's so good with bracing because it just puts you in the right position immediately. All right, and then last on this list for the squat, for powerlifting specific variations, is going to be the barefoot squat. And this is going to be an exercise that I don't write this a lot, but there is some niche uses. A lot of times I'm combining this with another variation. I'm putting it on top of a tempo. I'm putting it on top of a pause. And I think the biggest benefit of the barefoot squat is it takes the shoes out of the equation. It lets the coach be able to see what's going on with the foot and gives the athlete more awareness of what's going on with the foot. So if you're having issues of center of mass management, a barefoot squat's great, and it's going to provide direct feedback. If you are off with your foot rooting, where you're on your heels too much or you're on your toes too much, giving something like a barefoot squat, like the athlete's going to feel that, and it's going to give them negative feedback. It's going to hurt a little bit. It's not going to be comfortable. You're going to want to stay balanced with the barefoot squat. So that's another one. If someone's using something like heels where they wear like a heeled shoe, you can give a barefoot squat and just have someone squat on like a 5-pound plate with their heel on like a 5-pound plate. Again, though, I think the barefoot squat's pretty niche. It's not something I write for a lot of people. I probably wouldn't have even included it in this list, but I do currently have an athlete using it right now with their tempo squats. So I wanted to go ahead and throw it in. And from a loading standpoint, it's going to load very similarly to the comp squat, so it's not really going to be load limiting. It's going to be the one of the ones on this list that's not necessarily load limiting. So that's going to cover squat variations specifically for powerlifting. Again, that's going to be the pause squat, the tempo squat, the high bar squat, the SSB squat, and the barefoot squat. All right, next up on this list is going to be tempo bench press. And this is an exercise I am very commonly prescribing. I think this is one I probably have almost, if not every one of my athletes on my roster doing tempo bench press in some fashion, whether we're going heavy with that or light with that. The big benefits of the tempo bench press: leg drive improvements. You're going to have more time to focus on what your legs are doing with a tempo bench press. So if someone's having issues with they're bringing the bar down on their chest, they are rocking, off of their legs and then back onto their legs, maybe their butt's coming up, and they're having issues with that consistent, constant leg drive that we're often teaching with a soft touch bench presser. Tempo bench press is a great exercise. It's going to, bias into more control. It's going to just kind of force that. So if someone is dive bombing their bench press onto their chest, tempo bench press is a great one, and it's going to be great for producing better touches. So I really like tempo for that. Another thing, upper body related, we've talked about some of the lower body, just general setup and leg drive stuff. If someone's having issues with overly flaring or overly tucking their elbows, tempo bench press is great. The way I like to cue it is have the bar in the hand, let that bar really settle in the hand nicely, but then just think about lowering the hand slowly and let the elbows do what they want. Don't force the elbows into any sort of extra movement. Squeezing through the pinkies is a great cue as well with this, and it's going to let those elbows just kind of do what they want to do and kind of stack naturally under the barbell. So I love tempo bench press for that reason. Now, there are some cons with tempo bench press. I think the biggest one is if you have someone who biases into a more sinking style bench press, like a sink and heave style, where they are letting off the legs and then heaving it off the chest, and they're getting a big sink and they're getting that aggressive leg drive. Tempo is probably not a great exercise for them. It's just you're not gonna get the benefits that you are looking for out of it if that's your style of bench. So if you have a consistent leg drive approach to bench with a soft touch, tempo is amazing. I think it's not a one size fits all, but it's pretty close to a one size fits all. You can give it to most soft touch benchers and see some kind of benefit. I'm oftentimes writing this exercise closer to like a primary day, like on maybe a tertiary day, like the day before that primary session. So I really like the tempo bench press for that reason, just as a priming style exercise. From a loading standpoint, this is going to be really dependent on reps you're doing, but I find, I'm usually riding tempo in the lower rep ranges, so I'm usually finding 95 to 96% kind of being the loading that this is going to be at in comparison to the comp bench. So again, let's say you have a top set of 3 on comp bench, and then, let's say that's an RP8. If you want a top set of 3 RP8 tempo bench, you just need to take that comp bench number, subtract about, 96%, or sorry, 4%, and that's going to be your number. It's going to be 96% of the top set. So that's kind of how I like to write the tempo bench. All right, so next is long pause bench press, and this is, very self-explanatory. We're just pausing for longer. And in powerlifting, we are waiting for a press command. Oftentimes, we're going to be, asked by judges to hold the bar on our chest for a little while. And training long pause can be a great way to really do this. I find the number one way I'm programming long pause is either kind of on a prime or tertiary session, similar to tempo bench, where I'm doing it leading into the primary day, or on like a secondary day with a heavy top set, like a single or double. And sometimes I like to do that just simply for psychological purposes to differentiate from that primary day. If I'm doing a top single on the primary day and I want to do a single on the secondary day as well, I can program them both to similar RPs and similar intensity zones, but just giving like a 2 or 3 count pause bench, 2 to 3 second hold on the chest is a great way to just get it a little bit different for psychological purposes. Obviously, there's physical benefits as well. The technique benefits, being better at holding the bar on your chest, managing that position on your chest with the leg drive. I think it's similar to tempo bench. It's kind of like the tempo to squat or tempo to pause with the squat. It's similar to this with the bench press. It's just a less extreme version of the tempo bench. I think a lot of the same benefits apply, but I think the biggest thing is a psychological thing where you can put it on a secondary day. People kind of feel like, oh, well, it's longer pauses to 2 or 3 count pause. I'm not going to use as much weight, and they're not as neurotic about loading. Again, this is really good in prep for a meet to really force someone to pause, a lot longer on the chest because that's what they're going to be asked to do. And like I said, from a programming standpoint, I like this a lot on like secondary day or tertiary days or even away from meets. Putting it on the primary day is fine, or leading directly into meets. I mean, this is a variation that's very easy to just plug in and give to someone, especially for some of the lower rep, heavier work. I love the long pause bench. From a load limiting standpoint, it's not going to be much, 96, 97%, depends on how long you hold, but I usually like to write this anywhere from, 2 count to like 3 count. That's kind of the bread and butter for me, anywhere in there. And a lot of times you can just, if an athlete's not kind of pausing as long as you want, you just add a count on there. If you write 2 count and they're not quite getting it 2 count, just write it 3, the next block or next week or whatever, and they're going to hold that bar longer. But I love the long pause bench, 2, 3 count bench. I think it's so useful for most lifters, if not every lifter could benefit from doing some sort of long pause work, and you could probably do it year round. All right, so next up's Larson press, and I also love this exercise for a variety of reasons. One, I'll throw a video up on the screen. You don't have the legs involved. It becomes purely an upper body exercise at this point. So I think there's some hypertrophy benefits of that. Just pressing, just brute strength pressing the barbell. Again, that's a little anecdotal, but I think the biggest benefit is a little bit of a longer range of motion. More demand of controlling the barbell at the chest because you don't have the stability of the legs. You can really run into issues if you're not very good at controlling the bar on your chest. And it's great for people who just touch a little bit too hard. I love it to just put on like a secondary day back downs or tertiary day back downs. It's going to force really light touches because you don't have those legs. Lifters are going to want to control that barbell more. And like I said, from a hypertrophy standpoint, a little bit of a longer range of motion. I love this for people on like I said, back downs on like a secondary day or tertiary session. Back down work is great. You can do top sets too. I don't typically do this, but I know a lot of coaches will, a lot of athletes will, is heavier singles and doubles with Larson. I don't typically do that, but there is some utility there because, again, you don't have the legs. You are forced to really control that barbell really, really well. If not, you're going to get punished. From a loading standpoint, I find the Larson press is a good amount knocked off, 92% of that top set. So, again, if you have a top single at 8 and you want to do a single at 8 with Larson, it's going to be about 92, 93%, maybe 94 from that top set of comp bench, knocked off that. So, and that's going to equate across rep ranges. I find there's not a big swing in loading from, comparison to singles and 8s or whatever the case is. But I find myself generally programming these in like the 5 to 8 rep range. 4 to 8 rep range is kind of where I find the Larson press. I just like it a lot for kind of the higher rep back down work. All right, so last up on the bench press list is close grip bench. Now, this is not an exercise I actually program a whole lot of anymore, especially over the last year or so. I just haven't written a lot of close grip bench work for people. I do think there's a lot of utility though, and I did want to include that. So I think the one thing with the close grip bench is it's just more of a less bending of the rules in a sense. You're benching through a longer range of motion. So I think you have two big benefits here. One from a hypertrophy standpoint, where you are just spending more time just longer range of motion. It's going to typically probably bias into the triceps a little bit more. It's just going to be easy to soak up a lot of like work, rep work. When trying to pack on a lot of muscle. I think another benefit though that's sometimes overlooked is you can bench very heavy with close grip, and I think it's going to be a good exercise for those people with the high arches and the short range of motion by just lengthening that range of motion. You're keeping your arch, everything like that's the same, but you're just bringing the hands in, and you're just, again, a little bit anecdotal, but you're just training brute force bench press strength. And you're just getting strong. You're just getting stronger. There's not a whole lot. You can't finesse your way through a close grip bench. So I really like for that. And again, I think you can use it as, some lighter work on a tertiary, quaternary day or whatever, but you could also use it very heavy work on a primary, secondary day, and really spend a lot of time pressing through a lot of, some of that closer work, spending a lot of time working through that longer range of motion. So I don't program this a ton anymore. I did want to include it. Close grip bench. I think this one it's not going to be a too load limiting. It's going to just depend on how long your range of motion is. If you have a short comp bench range of motion where you're just, high arch, you're not moving the bar very far, and then you throw a close grip in there, it may make a big difference on how much you can press. So with this, I would stick to some like purely RPE based stuff or RPE, percent back down stuff. I probably wouldn't do a whole lot of percentage based stuff because I think you're just going to have a hard time pinpointing the right load on the bar. So, close grip, I did want to include it. It's not something I write a ton of anymore, but there is some, definite utility for sure. All right, so that's going to cover our bench press. Now on to deadlift. Deadlift, there's not as much options. You're kind of limited on deadlift with what you can do. In my opinion, exercises that are worth using. So starting off with the pause deadlift. This is the most common, I think. I personally write RDL more, and we'll get to that at the end. But I think the pause deadlift, super, super useful, specifically for sumo deadlifters. I think this is an exercise you're really only going to really write for sumo deadlifters. I don't program a ton of conventional pause work, here and there. It's been very sparse in my experience. Sumo, I love it. I think the biggest benefits is a lot of times you get people where you give them a pause deadlift, and let me preface by saying the pause deadlift, I like to write it just off the floor. I tell people pause as close to the floor as you can. The biggest things I see with a sumo deadlift is people who rush their pull off the floor. They yank on the bar, they rush their wedge, and then they slam into the bar and they get it moving. The pause deadlift forces you to slow down. Because you're pausing, a lot of people, they know they need to slow that wedge down. They need to be ready for the pause. And in fact, the way I like to cue it for people is I don't even think about pausing. I tell people, I almost want you to tempo the bar to the point where you pause and then finish. So that way, if this is the force curve, right? The bar's here on the floor, and then it gets going a little bit, they pause, and then they finish, right? And I want that slow exposure and this slow ramping of tension into the legs. We don't want 0 to 100. We want to think like 0, 20, 40, 50, 100. And that ramping of tension off the floor to the pause and then finishing. I think one thing with the pause deadlift is you can use it year round. Oftentimes, just putting like a pause single on your primary day and having that be your primary deadlift single for most of the year is a great thing if you're running singles year round. Putting heavier pause work on a secondary day I find is great for people who need their deadlift primed. The reason being is it's just so similar to the comp movement. And from a loading standpoint, for sumo pullers, it's not going to be a big reduction in load, if any. So we can use it from like a skill retention standpoint very easily. You can just put it in, and some people you're going to find really just need a pause deadlift all the time to like know how to pull. And if you'll find if you pull it out, they kind of forget how to deadlift. So I love the pause deadlift for that reason. Conventional, less utilization. I think if someone's really having issues off the floor, just losing position entirely, it can be fine. But I would argue a beltless deadlift is a better option for that. All right, so beltless deadlift. I'm going to preface this by saying my friend Eric Hogan, or Agent21EMH on Instagram, has an excellent informative post on the beltless deadlift, as well as he has a guest feature on Powerlifting Now. I believe it was last month, so it would have been October, covering the beltless deadlift. So if you want a full video on or breakdown beltless deadlift, He can do that topic much better than I can. I don't prescribe a ton of beltless deadlift, but the utilization I see a lot is conventional pullers, and Eric's going to probably echo a lot of what I'm going to say here is it's going to be very, very beneficial for those who really dump that pelvis underneath them. We're going to see some benefit from that from the pause deadlift, but not quite as much. The beltless deadlift is going to be great for people who are really rounding under. They're slamming that pelvis underneath them, and they're getting into like a posterior pelvic tilt. The beltless deadlift can be great for that. It's just going to be kind of uncomfortable and force the lifter to get more extended. Now, again, we can see that with the pause deadlift. We can see that benefit with the pause deadlift, but beltless deadlift might be better for that reason. I think where the beltless deadlift, though, is similar to the pause deadlift is that patience off the floor because you don't have the belt. It can just be a little uncomfortable, like I said, and you can kind of put that in, and people are going to, stay in a better position and be more patient off the floor. So, again, I just want to gloss over the beltless deadlift. I don't have a ton of experience programming it. My friend Eric does, though. Go check out his informative post on Instagram. It's fantastic, as well as his video on Powerlifting Now is an even deeper, in-depth dive to that, and he can do that topic justice. All right, last but certainly not least, probably my favorite deadlift variation in general, especially for the conventional lifters, and maybe my favorite variation just in all of powerlifting, all the lifts, is the Romanian deadlift, or the RDL. I think this exercise is fantastic. I think an RDL is something every lifter can get benefit from, whether you're prescribing this more as an accessory movement or more as a variation. So I program the RDL in two different ways. I either write it with a barbell and a belt or something different than that. So dumbbells, beltless with a barbell. I think the belt can make a big difference in loading. So I'll typically treat it like a variation and treat it as deadlift volume when writing it with a belt. I'll have people strap up, and I generally like to have people walk it out of the rack. So I'll put a video up on the screen now of the RDL walking out of the rack and actually executing the RDL. Great exercise. It's a pure hip hinge. Okay, the conventional deadlift, I think of them as a spectrum. Sumo's not as much of a hip hinge, more of, like a squatting kind of pattern, depending on build. Conventional is going to be a little bit more on the hip hinge, on that spectrum. RDL is just the pure hip hinge. I think from a hypertrophy standpoint and just a general posterior chain like musculature and strength standpoint, RDL is king. And I think this is an exercise a lot of people should include in their programming. Again, whether you want to use it as something very heavy variation where you're putting a belt and straps on and you're walking out of the rack and you're going really heavy, or if you're maybe going with dumbbells and you're definitely doing it beltless and your dumbbells, or you're just a barbell and you're doing some higher rep, maybe some tempo work, the RDL is useful in I think all scenarios for almost all lifters. I think it's something where you can put it on a secondary day really light and it can just keep that hinge pattern from a skill retention standpoint very high. So if you see people really struggling with the pelvis rolling underneath them when they're wedging into deadlift, whether conventional or sumo, the RDL is great for that purpose as well, just from a skill retention standpoint. And then, like I said, from a hypertrophy standpoint, it is just going to be more purely focused on the hamstrings and glutes. You're going to get a longer range of motion on the hamstrings and glutes. So it's great for that purpose as well. So I love the RDL. Again, if I'm wanting to program it more like a variation, I'll write it with a belt and I'll write it with a barbell. And I'll typically write it in like that 5 to 8 rep range. If I'm writing it more as an accessory movement, kind of depending on where my thought process is, but if I'm, thinking hypertrophy, I might be throwing a tempo on there. I might be doing dumbbells. I'm probably going to go towards a barbell because you can load it a little heavier, but I'm going beltless. It's just going to limit the load a lot. And that's when I'm treating it more like an accessory movement. Again, this one can kind of be on the spectrum of, is it a variation, is it an accessory? That's kind of up to the coach to decide how they want to use it and fit it in the program. I think another thing with this is you can use it, like I said, on a secondary day or even on a primary day. Just throw some dumbbells and have someone do some dumbbell RDL. You don't even need to really ride it heavy. A lot of times what I'm doing is 3-second tempo RDL with like a 3-second descent with dumbbells. RP like 5 to 6 or 4 to 6, somewhere in that range, in like the 5 to 7 rep range. Great for practice. Doesn't need to be heavy, but someone gets that hinging skill practice, skill retention. So I love the RDL. I think it's like a golden exercise. I think a lot of people really struggle with hinging properly. And if you struggle with the hip hinge pattern, especially with your deadlift, even with your squat too, to an extent, I think the RDL is the best way to really get good at this movement because it's a pure hip hinge. And then lastly with the RDL, it's generally going to be easier on the low back. Not in all cases, but if someone is struggling pulling twice a week from the floor, a lot of times you can just give them like a secondary day of RDL. They're going to recover a lot better with that low back, but you're going to be able to still stimulate the glutes and the hamstrings and the posterior chain in general. It's just going to be easier on them from a fatigue standpoint, and easier to just soak up volume. So I think the RDL, another big one is you just soak up a lot of workload that's not super fatiguing. It's just more directly targeted towards the musculature you want to train. As powerlifters with low bar squatting and deadlifting, whether conventional or sumo, we just do a lot of low back work. If we can kind of just purely train the glutes and hamstrings, it can be a great way to really just train the deadlift and provide stimulus going into a primary session or whatever the case may be by using an RDL and get away from the pulling from the floor that might fatigue the back a little bit more. So that's not always the case with everyone, but generally I find people can kind of shift that stress into their hamstrings and glutes and away from their low back. All right, so that's going to cover the variations I personally like to use when writing athletes training. So there's other variations out there. Those are the ones I find myself writing most. So those are the ones I kind of just wanted to make sure I covered very thoroughly. Again, there's other stuff out there. One other thing I wanted to touch on though that I've kind of alluded to, but I haven't really dove into this idea is you can combine variations. You're not stuck with just pause squats or just tempo squats. You're not stuck with just Larson press or just close grip. Like you can combine variations and get, the best of both worlds. I'll just use one example here. If you have someone who's having some center of mass management problems, and also some upper body fatigue, pause high bar squat is great. You can save the elbow, save the shoulder, save the wrists by going high bar, but you can also manage that center of mass and really work on that foot control and that control in the bottom of the squat with a pause. So you can combine variations. This goes for all the lifts. You can double stack or triple stack variations. You could do a tempo pause high bar, right? You could high bar squat, tempo descent, and pause on the bottom. Like that's an example of something you could do. So you can be creative with this. I was just kind of diving into each individual variation's benefits, but you can combine them and get the best of both worlds and get benefits from both variations if that's what you want. As well as combining variations is going to add more of a load limiting aspect. If you do something like a tempo pause squat or a tempo high bar pause squat, like that's going to be lighter than just a high bar squat or just a pause squat or just a tempo squat. So there's that benefit as well. So you can combine variations, stack these, and get stacked benefits. All right, that's going to cover it for this video of the all-encompassing guide of variations in powerlifting training. So if you enjoyed this video, please leave a like. You can subscribe as well. If you have any questions or just anything you want to, let me know, leave them in the comments down below. I'd be happy to have a conversation or help anyone out if they have any questions. As well as you can just reach out to me on Instagram at Powerlifting with Jake or at Rocket Strength Powerlifting. Those are my two Instagram pages. Down below as well is going to be my link tree in the description. That's going to have more information on my coaching services, as well as a link to like my Spotify, where my podcast is, as well as my podcast is on this YouTube channel as well. So again, at Rocket Strength Powerlifting and at Powerlifting with Jake are my two Instagram handles, and you can reach me pretty easily on there if you want to shoot me a DM if you have any questions, whether it be this video or regarding coaching, and I'd be happy to help anyone out. So thank you for watching, and I hope you enjoyed.